Well, good morning, and can I welcome everyone to this, the 7th meeting of the Public Audit Committee in 2025. Agenda item 1 is for members of the committee to consider whether or not to take agenda items 3 and 4 in private this morning. Are we all agreed? We are agreed, thank you. And agenda item 2 is consideration of the joint report by the Auditor General and the Accounts Commission on sustainable travel, reducing car use. I'm very pleased to welcome our witnesses this morning, who are Stephen Boyle, the Auditor General, and the Auditor General is joined this morning by Cornelius Chikwama, who's an Audit Director at Audit Scotland, also by Ashley Majiti, who is an Audit Manager at Audit Scotland, and I'm pleased to say we're also joined by Malcolm Bell, who is here representing the Accounts Commission. Mr Bell, you're very welcome to the committee. We've got some questions to put to you on the report, but before we turn to those, Auditor General, could I invite you to make an opening statement?
Good morning, Convener. Good morning, Committee. Today, as you mentioned, Convener, bringing the joint report from the Accounts Commission and myself, produced by Audit Scotland, on sustainable transport, reducing car use. Convener, domestic transport is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Scotland, and these are reducing at a slower rate than any other sector. In 2020, the Scottish Government set an ambitious but very challenging target to reduce the total car kilometres driven in Scotland by 20% by 2030. Over 4 years later, the Scottish Government does still not have a clear plan to do this, and car kilometres driven in Scotland have been increasing since the COVID-19 pandemic. We are currently moving away from the delivery of this target. Our audit has identified a lack of leadership that has resulted in minimal progress in reducing car use. The final route map remains in draft form, and there is no costed or resourced delivery plan which provides measurable milestones. Indeed, it is unclear if the Scottish Government remains committed to this target. The upcoming climate change plan gives the Scottish Government the opportunity to clarify its intentions. Scotland's councils have an important role to play in reducing transport emissions, but they face different challenges in doing so, and some are prioritising contributing to the target more than others. The audit recommends that the Scottish Government provides more guidance to both them and regional transport partnerships on their role in achieving the target. The Scottish Government and councils are also not able to say how much has been spent on achieving the target. Spending on measures to reduce car use is complex, fragmented and lacks transparency. Our judgment is that it is now unlikely that the Scottish Government will achieve its target of reducing by 20% of car use by 2030. The Scottish Government has not said how failure to reduce car use will affect its wider ambitions to achieve net zero targets by 2045. It will find it hard to significantly reduce transport emissions unless it makes difficult and potentially unpopular decisions to discourage car use through demand management measures. Convener, as ever, very much looking forward to answering the committee's questions this morning. And as you mentioned, very pleased that I'm joined by Malcolm Bell from the Accounts Commission. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And in your opening statement, you repeated something which is in the written report, the conclusion you reach, which is that it is unlikely that the Scottish Government will achieve its target by 2030. So my opening question is really to ask if you could elaborate a little bit more on why you reach that stark conclusion, but also to ask, was it ever an achievable target?
So really on those 2 points, I think the rate of change suggests that we are moving away from the delivery of this target rather than closer to it. Context is always very important, Convener, but I think perhaps to highlight to the committee that this target was set during the COVID-19 pandemic, which for very clear reasons that we'll all recall, car use, by virtue of some lockdown restrictions, dropped significantly. Since then, car use has recovered. Active travel or public transport use is not back up to the level that it was before the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'll bring colleagues on a moment. Maybe Ashley might want to say a bit more about some of the detail behind this. But I think very significantly, and it's something the committee will be familiar with when we describe what we're talking about is implementation, effective implementation of a significant public policy. The best chance of achieving effective implementation is to have a clear delivery plan. As I mentioned in opening remarks, costed plan, evaluation methodologies, and that clear milestone delivery and so forth. We didn't see that when we undertook this audit. And as I mentioned in my opening remarks, Convener, I think some ambiguity would suggest as to whether or not the Scottish Government remains committed to the delivery of this target. But I'll bring Ashley in. She might say a bit more about some of the recent trends.
Yeah, so Exhibit 4 shows the vehicle kilometres over time, and you can see that there was a big dip during the pandemic, and it's gone straight back up again. We also found that to reach the level needed to reduce car use by 20%, we'd need to be back at 1994 levels of traffic. So that goes back to that it was always a very ambitious target. Also, Exhibits 6 and 7 show the trends in cycling and active travel and in public transport, and both of those are going in the wrong direction.
I mean, again, in the report, you say it's not possible to see how the national target of 20% will be achieved, but you also say it's impossible to understand which interventions will have the most impact on the target or best deliver value for money. I mean, that's quite a damning critique, isn't it?
So our report is based on the evidence we found. So I think really setting out that, and this is an unusual example, I think, to be clear with the committee, we don't regularly see public policy intent that's not underpinned with the level of planned implementation arrangements such as this, but not to have a clear understanding as to which parts of active travel or changes in demand management or the role that individual organisations will play in that, never mind governance, which we touch on in the report, not seeing those as effective as needed to be, have all contributed to where we are today. That, as I think we've said in the report, we don't expect this target to now be achieved.
And you've been quite critical already about the level of evaluation undertaken and so on. Can I ask you about equality impact assessments? Because again, one of the themes in the report is that there can be an unequal impact, including of some of the demand management measures, which we'll get to later on. But have you got a sense of whether full equality impact assessments are taken on the current transport system, are taken when there are proposals to change or make a modal shift, for example? Is that part and parcel of how Transport Scotland, the Scottish Government, approaches this?
Yeah, certainly I'll bring colleagues in to share a bit of detail from the work convener with some of the arrangements, but it's clear that there's a degree of varied picture in the application of evaluation in the round, whether it's equality's impact, and there is evidence that the availability of public transport arrangements, car use, car provision, has correlation with other areas of deprivation, equalities, employment opportunities, and so forth. We also found, just again, and I'll bring Ashley and Cornelius and of course Malcolm come in at any point he wishes, that the evaluation, just to highlight in paragraph 81, evaluation arrangements are of various projects are in place, but not to the extent that these are collated to form meaningful conclusions. So there's again work convener about for the Scottish Government to understand clearly which particular parts of its interventions have the most significant bearing and to delivery of its target. This will be fundamental to where it goes next with its plans to deliver a route map and also clarify its intentions. But I'll pause, actually, if maybe Cornelius or Ashley wants to come in on this.
Yes. I think Ashley will also come in on this point. I mean, in relation to the target, there was some consideration of equalities. We can debate how complete those considerations were. There was a focus on recognizing that car use tends to be mostly benefiting people with higher socioeconomic status or from higher socioeconomic backgrounds. There seemed to be an assumption that, well, if we are reducing car use, we are increasing public transport. Therefore, actually reducing car use would benefit, those people who can't afford to drive. But then when you start looking at what has actually happened, we are not seeing any improvement in public transport use. At the same time, we are not seeing any change in car use either. So it then raises the question whether the way the measures are being delivered are being effective in tackling those intended sort of reduction or managing of inequalities that Scottish Government had identified around this. There are other dimensions to inequality linked to geography, people who can't avoid use of cars because of disabilities, but maybe my colleague Ashley might be able to say more about how those have been looked at.
Thank you, Cornelius. Yeah, just as the Auditor General said, we've seen evaluations happening for some of the big projects, so the young person's bus pass or Glasgow South City Way. There are evaluations going on. What we're not seeing is that kind of consideration of the impact on car use and what those measures, what the impact they've actually had on car use. And it's not been pulled together in any kind of way. And that's linked back again to not having a clear delivery plan with clear measurable milestones to kind of set to measure against, really.
And you make the same point in the report, don't you, about the peak fares experiment in ScotRail, where again you're quite explicit that the impact on car use of reinstating peak fares is not part of the evaluation, which is quite staggering, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I think just to comment briefly on that. So this to refer to the committee to case study 1, where we can sit in a bit of detail the arrangements for the 12-month pilot to remove peak fares and the government's assessment that it did not attract enough passengers to rail and, of course, the additional context that the committee will remember of funding pressures that was attributed to why peak fares were then reinstated. We go on to say, convener, that the Scottish Government's view was that the subsidisation of or removal of peak fares did not represent value for money in the current financial climate. However, to again back to some of the kind of the wider aspects of evaluation, is that the report doesn't outline what the impact of reinstating peak fares has on the other part of the transport system of the use of car use, or acknowledge that sometimes behavioural change doesn't happen in a 12-month period. It can take a longer period of time, communication, investment to support people to make alternative, called modal choices, but really effectively talking about going about their business in a different way. So I think for us that's a sense of where there are opportunities for the government to make our Transport Scotland, to make a wider range of criteria into the mix in arriving at that decision.
Okay, and there are lots of questions that arise from that. I suppose if I can move things on, though, but in a related way, and presumably we're expecting when a target like this is announced, 20% reduction in car kilometres by 2030, compared to the 2019 baseline, I think, wasn't it? We would expect there to be a kind of cross-government drive on that. What you've described doesn't even appear to be a cross-transport drive on it. But where do you see cross-government working to tackle or to meet the target that was set? Was a clear, as you say, important signal of public policy.
I'm sure we'll all might want to kind of express a view on this. Certainly, Malcolm, I'm sure, from the assessment of the vital role that Scotland's councils, will need to play and were expected to play together with the role that the regional transport partnerships. But maybe just kind of stepping back for a moment, Convener, we've said in the report that we didn't think there was sufficient leadership with which to clarify intentions. Ashley's quite rightly mentioned again about the lack of a delivery plan, just to support how we move from where we were in 2019 or where we were during the COVID-19 pandemic to deliver this target. That was necessary, and as we touched on again in the report, is that Scotland's councils are still looking for that clarity, that guidance from the Scottish Government about what role they are expected to play. And I think with some justification, Convener, that is being cited by partners, and again, maybe go to Malcolm first of all, that without that delivery plan, is guidance going to really help partners to do what's expected of them, recognising that there's wide variation across Scotland and the ability of different parts of the country to play their part to deliver upon this target. We can say further about how governance and partnership working has operated, but keen for the committee to hear from Malcolm first of all.
Yeah. Thank you, Convener. Yeah, as the Auditor General says, I think clear guidance on roles and responsibilities would be welcomed by councils. I think, and we've touched on it in the report, I think part of the reason it wasn't was that councils in Scotland are so diverse, and I think the wish was for councils to develop their own priorities, because rural councils have very different issues from city and urban councils. So I think that was part of the issue. But I think now we've got to the stage where clear guidance on expectations, roles and responsibilities, and the monitor and evaluation of achieving this target would be very much welcomed.
You're not here to speak on behalf of COSLA, but it does mention in the report that there was supposed to be a joint governance group being established, presumably involving local authority leaders and agencies and central government leaders and agencies. Has that governance group been constituted yet?
So there's been, you're right, there's been slow progress actually. We might have an update, I think, some of the kind of recent developments, and maybe ask Ashley just to share some of that with the committee in a moment. What I might remind as though we produced a report on the Scottish Government's arrangements, I think it was 2023, on how they were organising themselves to deliver upon climate change arrangements. And in that report, I think it was talked about some progress, but one of the things that we did highlight on was that top-level governance arrangements hadn't moved at the pace that the government had intended it to do so to deliver its climate change ambitions, Convener. And this report, looks back over a 5-year period. So there is an alignment here, I would say, that governance for the delivery of challenging climate reduction or carbon emission targets wasn't in place for much of the time that we're talking about. But again, I'll bring Ashley back in, Ashley, if there's anything we have any more kind of up-to-date information.
Thank you. I don't know if Cornelius wants to say more as well, but so paragraph 30, we talk about the governance arrangements, and we say that they are yet to establish a joint governance group. That's largely to do with the lack of delivery plan and wanting to have a delivery plan in place before that was, or a lack of a final route map, but have that in place before they established it. We also say that they're in the process of establishing a joint governance group to strengthen the way that national and local government work together. And that's for across climate change as a whole, rather than just focusing on transport. And we know that the first meeting of that happened in December last year.
Okay, right. Thanks, that's helpful. I mean, you've mentioned, Auditor General, there again, a lack of leadership. A lack of leadership at what level?
So the report draws attention to a couple of factors, Convener. One, I suppose, that the governance structures weren't in place. These are the fora for which senior leaders, political leadership too, can come together to support the direction, ultimately prioritisation and choice. And I think that's where our key concerns remain, that these key groups, the key direction for public bodies in Scotland, but ultimately the public, have clarity of what choices are being encouraged to be made. So we reference that throughout the report. We don't make a direct link, but we just draw attention to that there's been considerable turnover of ministers in these roles for the duration of this ambition, and the need, and we make recommendations in today's report, that there is clarity of governance that is implemented as intended, so that public bodies who are charged with supporting implementation of the delivery of this target, helping the public to make choices, have clarity around priority and how those decisions and funding and so forth will be made.
I mean, it doesn't escape the notice of this committee that it is senior elected politicians, up to and including previous First Ministers, that have declared a climate emergency and presumably have pronounced on the need to meet this 20% reduction target by 2030. So if there is a lack of leadership, I think we might draw a conclusion that there is a lack of political leadership as well as a lack of some kind of agency leadership by those who are charged with delivering on this.
I think maybe just one final brief thing, maybe just to recognise, and again, it's, in the report, Convener, is there has been turnover of sort of political leadership, but also the positioning of the Butte House Agreement, and brought in additional targets together with anticipated allocation of funding for the delivery of some targets. These have resulted in change of emphasis. I think we've seen a step back from some of those ambitions in the Butte House Agreement since that arrangement ended. We're noticeably referencing the bus partnership funding as, again, as public spending that took place on that and has now stepped back from it, and particularly Scotland's councils perhaps not having the clarity of to what was expected or is now expected of them now that that arrangement has come is over.
Yeah, I mean, again, as you say, things like the 2030 emissions reduction target has been dropped altogether, hasn't it?
Well, indeed, you've seen that at 75%.
And that's a kind of an overarching thing, and below that, there are examples of things that have been discontinued and dropped and so on. Can I just ask you a final question from me before I invite Graham Simpson to put some questions to you? And that is, again, it's been a subject of debate and discussion at this committee before, which is about how does a government with a £50 to £60 billion budget, how does it reconcile competing priorities? So, for example, I observe that I think the expenditure on rail is going down, but the expenditure on trunk roads is going up. So if we've got a target on car kilometres to be met, how does all that get reconciled? Or does it?
So, thankfully, Convener, these are choices not for me, but for politicians, and especially in the consideration of the budget. There's maybe two factors I would point to. And I think I said similar last week when we spoke about economy and income tax and how these two factors align. The importance of longer-term financial planning and the alignment of those with policy. That we don't have an up-to-date medium financial strategy in Scotland isn't just for the importance of financial planning in and of itself, but actually it supports choices and the scrutiny of those choices. Because you're right, of course governments don't just have to do one thing. They'll have to make trade-offs, prioritisation, both in policy and spending. And I think we touch on in today's report, as it relates to car use reduction, that both things are happening in terms of public transport use, investment in roads, and also the support for public transport. So these are very clearly choices, but I think what point we make is that the choices and the spending are not as transparent as they need be to help implementation and also the scrutiny of those choices.
But you also said earlier on that your assessment was that we're moving away from rather than closer to that target.
Well, very much so. I think that's clear in today's report that current trajectory is that it's very unlikely that Scotland is going to deliver the intended car use reduction by 2030. I mentioned ambiguity, and I think there's a government has published a consultation, updated consultation in the past couple of days that suggests that it is reviewing its commitment to this target. I mentioned earlier that what remains to be clarified as to what impact this will have on its overarching vision of net zero by 2045.
Right, thank you. I'm now going to invite Graham Simpson to put some questions to you. Graham.
Yes, thanks very much. And I'm hearing some feedback, which Mr. Bell got as well. I wonder if that could be sorted. Just on that consultation which was launched this week, I didn't see anything in that which said that the government is dropping this target. Did you?
Yeah, so again, given the timescale, we've done some limited review of it, Mr. Simpson, but I think what we'll perhaps point to is that one of the figures in the report, the timescale for mainstreaming car decarbonisation as medium term. I think so. This is some of the lines. So it's perhaps it's not clear that it says that the government's stepping away from the target, but I think it brings a further ambiguity on its intentions. And as we're clear in the report that I think there has been ambiguity based on the fact that we don't have a route map. Governance arrangements haven't been clear as to whether this is still part of the government's longer term intention towards net zero in 2045. So I think that's really the basis of why I'm using again the phrase ambiguity on the duration of this target for 2030.
Where do you think the target came from? Where do you think they got this 20% figure from?
So again, if I can find the right paragraph, and colleagues can direct me to, is that. Thank you. Draw the committee's attention to paragraph 14 in today's report, which kind of set out some of the history of arriving at it. So perhaps just kind of one of the bullet points that references that Transport Scotland consulted on a draft route map, but that consultation did not have the target included of 20% reduction. Transport Scotland also undertook modelling of, but it only considered a 20% reduction based on an assessment of the transport sector. So I think, again, a very ambitious target, no doubt, but I think also a lack of clarity as to why 20%, why not 15%, why or 25%. So that there wasn't a proposed target in the consultation, and that arrived as part of the planned implementation arrangements, feels like an unusual kind of process to follow. I think it would have been a better set of arrangements to either consult on a single target or indeed a range of targets and to receive views from stakeholders on those. Especially, as you remember, Mr Simpson, this was during COVID when this target was set, and that it would have required car use levels to have returned to what they were in the mid-1990s.
So my conclusion from that is this is just it's a made-up figure, really. It could have been anything, as you say. It could have been 10%, 15%, 30% even. It doesn't seem to be based on anything, and certainly not anything realistic.
So I would say, and again, colleagues might want to come in on this, is that there's no doubt that this was viewed as a stretching target. Absolutely. The one that would have been designed to gather momentum, intentions for Scotland's car users. But we are clear in the report, though, that it wasn't underpinned as it needed to be, given the scale of ambition within it, by how we're going to get there. And that's really the fundamental issue I think we're talking about.
Absolutely. It's really stretching. In fact, to quote paragraph 14, it says, now, when I read this out, I'm going to convert the figures into miles, not kilometres. And this was a disappointment for me in your report, is that you've fallen into the Scottish Government trap of using kilometres and not miles. Because if I was to ask you how far it is from Edinburgh to Glasgow, you wouldn't give it to me in kilometres. So just bear with me, I'm just going to use real money. You say to achieve the target, car traffic levels will need to decrease by 4.5 billion miles to 18 billion miles compared to a 2019 baseline. The last time car traffic levels were at this level was 1994. And you also quote, you say that Transport Scotland estimates that to achieve that 20% reduction in car miles by 2030, public transport capacity would need to increase by 222%. None of that is achievable and never was. So based on that, and based on the lack of a plan, do you think the government should just be honest and say they've ditched it?
So I think there does need to be transparency, absolutely, about the government to be clear on what its intentions are in terms of car usage across Scotland, so that it can be clear with its partners in Scotland's councils and road transport partnerships what that means also for the wider aspects of it, because people still need to travel, of course. So if not through individual car usage, what does that mean for active travel arrangements, public transport, and wider aspects about, if not on a internal combustion engine car, about the provision of electric vehicles and charging points, which I should say we haven't considered as part of today's report. It's something we're considering as part of our future work programme.
Yeah, so maybe I can come in here. So I think there is a process going on at the moment, which is developing the next climate change plan. And I would like to believe, the consultation that the Auditor General has referred to on sort of the options for transport is part and parcel of the process. Maybe it is through the plan that we will see the government restating or otherwise its commitment to the target. So maybe that process is the process that the government is probably relying on, communicating its intentions on the target going forward.
Okay. So I'm not sure whether you agree with me or not there, but I just think they ought to be honest about it and say we're never going to achieve this. Therefore, the target is dropped, or we're going to change the target.
Hopefully, I can be clear. Actually, I think we are clear. There needs to be transparency about this. Government and in our recommendations in today's report is calls for that clarity of what's the government's intent about how it plans to deliver it, and especially just to highlight the committee's attention to by the end of 2025 to publish a realistic delivery plan that sets out how it's going to work with partners to deliver a restated target. I don't think we could be much clearer, Mr. Simpson.
Okay, that's fine. So that delivery plan, or you could call it a route map, whatever you want to call it, it's the same thing. It's not appeared yet. And you're obviously saying, well, they need to publish that. I don't think they will. If they've dropped the target, then they're not going to publish a route map to hit a target they're not going to achieve, but we'll wait and see. If they were to publish such a plan, what do you think, what kind of level of detail needs to be in it?
Well, effectively addressing the points that we haven't seen thus far, that there's clear milestones, funding arrangements are set out, and all the various components therein of the respective roles that active travel, public transport will play. Again, maybe highlight to the committee Exhibit 8 in today's report, which talks about some of the various demand management measures, because I don't think there's much debate that there's going to have to be something of a carrot and stick approach deployed for car users about how they can find alternatives. It's also very relevant, and I'm sure the committee will explore this in a little bit more detail, is that not all of the levers that to support demand management are within the devolved powers of the Scottish Government. So finding a way of setting out a clear plan with all of these remains, I think, the most important next step for the Scottish Government to support itself and its partners.
Okay, I'm going to move on to another section, and that is around active travel funding. So Transport Scotland recorded active travel funding as spent, but it was held in a delivery partner's accounts. Transport Scotland didn't check any documentary evidence that the £82.5 million had been spent on projects before authorising payments. That's pretty extraordinary, isn't it?
Yes, this is not a good example of spending public money. I think what we are talking about here is Sustrans, Mr Simpson, which was one of the Scottish Government's active travel partners. And when public body, in this case the Scottish Government, pays money to a partner outside of government, whether it's third sector or otherwise, normally that comes with clear grant conditions, grant funding arrangements. So we'll give you money and you'll do this in return. What we have here, regrettably, is an example of those grant conditions not being followed. And that led to circumstances that Sustrans accumulated £72.5 million of unspent places for everyone funding in its accounts. Our analysis of this, and working closely with the auditors of Transport Scotland, suggests that the rationale for some of these behaviours came as I think I would call it a kind of workaround, so as to continue to deliver projects that spanned more than one financial year. That the committee, of course, will know that the Scottish Government's budget, and as Transport Scotland as one of its agencies, funding tends to be on a 12-month basis. Many of these projects, as I mentioned, span many years. Regardless of that, though, this approach didn't comply with the grant conditions. So if that's the case and the grant conditions weren't aligned to how the projects needed to be delivered, that should have been dealt with very clearly by the funder, in this case, Transport Scotland. I think what the only caveat I would or say rider to that, Mr Simpson, is that the money wasn't lost. So it was recovered and used as intended with the original requirements of the scheme, but it doesn't represent good financial controls or financial government or governance in that respect.
And so would you say that Transport Scotland, they lost control, really? They should have had a greater grip on the money that they were handing out?
So maybe just some of the detail on this, actually, paragraph 56. So having identified that £72.5 million had been built up in Sustrans accounts, in April of last year, it claimed and received a further £10 million. But Transport Scotland didn't check any evidence that the spend of these projects had been as intended before authorising payments. More rigour ought to have been deployed by Transport Scotland than it did, especially when some of the arrangements were pointed out as being non-compliant. So there is undoubtedly learning that, that Transport Scotland will want to take on this example specifically, but more widely about how it is deploying grant funding arrangements, how it's monitoring that when it's providing public money outside of public bodies.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I've got to say that, I mean, there's been quite a few of the projects that Sustrans have delivered, in my view, have been good. South City Way in Glasgow, in my view, is a good project, but its delivery was shambolic at times and it took far too long. But overall, I think it's been a good project. So we can't say that some of these things are, you know, are not good. I think that's an example of where there is evidence that people are using it, and certainly people locally, there is less car use because, you know, people now have a viable alternative to get from one part of the city into the city centre on a segregated route. So for me that's worked. However, we're now moving to a new system of funding where money is going to go, and perhaps this is one for you, Mr. Bell, money will be going direct to councils. And I just wonder, Mr. Bell, how you think that's going to work, because one of the issues which you'll be very familiar with in some councils is a lack of capacity. And probably particularly in rural councils. You mentioned rural areas earlier. So I just wonder how you think that this is all going to work.
Can I just clarify in terms of...
Sorry about this. There's a new system, there's a new model of funding where money is going to go direct to councils rather than through Sustrans. And I just wonder how you think some councils will cope with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point you made, I think some councils will cope with it better than others, and some councils will find it easier than others because they've got the capacity. There's a big difference in the sizes and capacities of councils across the country. So I think that is a moot point, Mr. Simpson.
I can maybe give a little bit more detail. So the Active Travel Investment Funds is the new way of doing active travel delivery. So 35 million is going to go direct to councils. This is just building on the cycling and walking and safer routes funding that councils already received. It's changed the allocation of that, so they've got a new system now to allocate the money to councils, but it's going through the same kind of process. And then there's an additional 10 million, which is through for more complex projects through bid funding. It's the first year of the new arrangements, and we make recommendations that they review that and to see whether this is actually delivering more efficient and effective spending. In general, the stakeholders that we spoke to, the councils and the RTPs, were fairly positive about what they think will happen. It's just been a challenging first year, as we set out in paragraph 65.
That's fine. I'm happy to leave it there, convener.
Okay, thank you, Graham. I'm now going to invite Colin Beattie to put some questions to you. Colin.
Thank you, Convener. Well, General, before I come to asking specific questions, there's one thing I noticed from your report, which is the comment that domestic cars are by far the biggest polluter within the transport system. I seem to remember a couple of years ago, and it is only a memory, that there was some quite detailed research done on this, and in fact, commercial vehicles and public transport by far overreached domestic transport as major polluters, which in a way is logical because, you know, commercial vehicles tend to use diesel and so on, and that's much more polluting perhaps than petrol. Do you have any memory on that?
I would probably need to check our source for that, Mr. Beattie. Cornelius can provide a bit more detail, but I guess maybe just draw attention to the committee in Exhibit 1, which really kind of sets out on a, I would call it a pie chart, but I'm not sure if that's the correct statistical term anymore, actually, but it's really the relative proportions of Scotland's emissions, and it's still citing domestic transport as being the single largest source, and we reference that as the Scottish greenhouse gas statistics that the Scottish Government provided in 2022. I acknowledge, I think it sounds like you're referring to more recent statistics than that. If you're content, maybe Cornelius can say a bit more, and then...
Just on Exhibit 1, if you can maybe comment on it, you clearly detail how much of that particular calculation is domestic transport. I'm not sure where in that you've got commercial vehicles and the like. It's not quite clear.
Yeah, no, thank you, Mr. Beattie. I think that breakdown is not in our report, but it is available in the Scottish Government, or rather Transport Scotland, statistics on greenhouse gas emissions.
In this breakdown of emissions, we've excluded commercial vehicles and public transport. Is that correct?
No, so that is including all domestic transport. So
that's included in domestic transport as well?
That's right.
Is that appropriate?
No, it is appropriate. So I think what we are showing in Exhibit 1 is how transport compares to other sources of greenhouse gas emissions. So agriculture, electricity generation.
As it says domestic transport, and to me defensive transport is a car. It's not.
Right.
It's not an articulated truck.
No, it is. I think it is a definitional point, and these definitions change. So when we talk about domestic transport, we are referring to all transport activities in Scotland, excluding international aviation and international maritime. So it's
trains. It includes buses.
That's right. So it's a very specific statistical definition, and the domestic element is just highlighting that we are excluding international aviation and international maritime. So what we then do is we break down that domestic transport into...
Because the word domestic implies domestic. It doesn't imply public transport or trucks or commercial vehicles.
Yes, so I think this is the challenge we have. I mean, there are standard statistical definitions, agreed by statistical authorities. As Audit Scotland, I think we are not in a position, we can't change them. So in our reporting, to be consistent with those standard reporting, we use the same phrases, but I completely agree with you. It's subject to various interpretation, and one of those interpretation might be domestic in the sense of what households are doing, so use of cars. But in this case, domestic has a very specific meaning for statistical reporting.
I mean, on that basis, just reading this, I would have said we've got to really be focusing on cars, whereas the probability is that the emissions from commercial vehicles, industrial vehicles and so on are much higher, and maybe we should be focusing on them. It sort of distorts your view.
Yes, so I mean, I was going to come to that point. So when you look at the official statistics by the Scottish Government, which then breaks down transport emissions by different sources, what you find is car use accounts for 41% of total emissions associated with transport. So that is the largest contributor to transport emissions. Light-duty trucks, for instance, that is only 15%. Heavy-duty trucks, it's 19%. So we have that detailed breakdown. I mean, we'd be happy to provide you with it. But we are confident, based on the official data, that car use is the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions associated with transport.
But only if you break down the commercial side into different size vehicles and so on to make the percentages smaller.
That is right. I mean, you could...
To see the statistics, if you can provide that to us, that would be...
Yeah, helpful. No, I think we'll make sure we provide the table to you.
Okay. In that case, I'll move on to bus services. Bus services are often quoted as being a problem. People that talk about giving up cars say that there's very poor public services in terms of buses, which is true in some areas. I just don't know, to what extent do you believe that it is true that the lack of buses is affecting travel decisions that people are making? And what's contributing to that?
So I think this, I'm happy to start actually, and I'll bring colleagues in again in a moment, but that's certainly one of the conclusions that we draw in today's report, just to signpost again to paragraph 66. So we're clear that a lack of bus services is affecting travel decisions. So there are fewer bus journeys that are being taken since the COVID-19 pandemic. And there are also fewer buses. So on both of those statistics, a 22% reduction between 2012 and 2022 in terms of bus travel levels. And alongside that, the number of buses on the roads fell by 30%. So availability or supply of bus services is a key factor in the choices that people have to make, Mr. Beattie, to go about their work, their travel, their leisure. We also know that that's a very significant bearing in rural areas, where you won't have the choice that in some of Scotland's urban settings will have about alternatives. The bus will be the lifeline service for people to go about their business. And if that's not there to the extent, government recognises this issue, of course they do. We have again, one of the case studies in today's report is about the extent of the rollout of the bus services or subsidised bus travel for young people. Bus services are also supported in terms of concessionary travel arrangements for people. But as I mentioned in response to one of the convener's earlier questions, the bus partnership funding has brought in some policy ambiguity about the extent to which that is part of the sustained funding arrangements for bus providers. So I think there are a range of factors that are at play in terms of why bus travel hasn't returned to pre-pandemic levels, and also its importance very clearly. If people are to use their cars less, they have to have a viable alternative.
We're, from our own experience, that councils have been withdrawing subsidies for bus services, particularly in the slightly more rural, quasi-rural areas. To what extent has that had a significant impact?
I might ask colleagues, actually, maybe I'm sure Malcolm might want to comment on that.
Well, I think it clearly will have an impact. But I mean, one of the things that we found was in speaking to communities and stakeholders was that the lack of reliable and affordable alternatives to car use, particularly and it's more acute in rural areas where journeys will be much longer, as a major barrier to giving up your car and taking an alternative. In rural areas, you very often, because of the size of the journeys, can't use active travel opportunities, and there very often isn't a train. So the bus is really the only other alternative.
I guess again, drawing on my local experience, there seems to be a tendency to have a hub and spoke approach to bus services, which makes it extremely difficult to move around a county, because you've always got to go back to the centre to then get another bus out, which is a huge disincentive to use the bus because it takes so long.
I can maybe say a wee bit about that, especially from a kind of equalities angle. So we've seen that people that maybe work shift patterns, so don't work in standard standard times, people that work in industrial parks on the outskirts of town. Those kind of factors mean that, yeah, the bus service doesn't work for them. They have to come into the city to go back out again. It takes a long time. There aren't the buses when they need to have buses. And so we found that, especially in people with lower incomes, they're running a car that they can't afford to have because that's the only alternative at the moment, because public transport isn't sufficient for them. And the Transport Scotland recognised that in their route map and in setting this target, that the current landscape doesn't work for a lot of people.
I think maybe just that briefly. I think as Ashley mentions, again, just perhaps reference paragraph 69 of today's report, that Transport Scotland administers what is called network support grants for bus operators. So, it's a form of public subsidy to support the provision of bus routes in parts of Scotland, and that equates to operators being paid 14.4 pence per kilometre of the bus journey. But its aims are to keep fares reasonable and support what will be an interpretation of the bus provider commercial routes. So that clearly won't suit everybody. So there will be some, I think, perhaps as you're alluding to in your own area, Mr. Beattie, that doesn't equate to a bus route necessarily where everybody wants it or needs it, and that might require 2, sometimes 3 journeys for people to get to where they need to. There's very clearly equality considerations as part of that, but and that's, again, I think perhaps goes back to some of our main conclusions in today's report as to how all of these moving parts come together to support the government's ambitions for its reduction in car use. But alongside that, is there a viable alternative for people to do just that?
It seems that there's different alternatives for subsidies for bus routes. Bus routes that operators consider to be less lucrative, and they expect to be topped up either by the government or the local council before they will provide those services. So clearly the scope to actually expand bus services is somewhat limited, because it's going to come from the public purse, the cost of subsidising these routes. How are we going to achieve that? How is that achievable?
I think these will be policy decisions for government. So is it, if it plans to move away from its current model of, as I mentioned, the network support grant for bus providers, or alternatives? Of course, government could do something different. I think as we're seeing with railway infrastructure or railway services and the nationalisation of ScotRail Holdings, Caledonian Sleeper, and so forth. These are choices that government could make if it wished to make additional provision. Again, I think it goes back to where really the core message on today's report is how do all the parts come together? If it's the government's plan to reduce car usage, what's the alternative to encourage people to do so? And I think, again, it's really not just the demand management alternatives, the provision of active travel arrangements, public transport alongside that. All of those choices have to be set out clearly.
Has there been any evaluation done by the government to assess the impact of existing funding on bus and rail services towards reducing car use?
Yeah, it's a very important point. Again, I'll bring colleagues in actually just to kind of set out, I suppose, across the range of different ways that public money is spent to support alternatives to car use. I think, as I'd mentioned a few minutes ago, we looked at in case study 1, the removal of the peak rail fares and then its reintroduction. So Transport Scotland's rather Scottish Government's valuation is that it wasn't value for money. So that the rail usage levels hadn't returned to the level that it had anticipated. However, again, I think it's an important point, apologies for repeating myself, the evaluation didn't outline the impact that reinstating peak fares would have on car usage. So Of course, there are competing priorities that government policymakers have to evaluate. And I think that's why, looking at today's report, and again going back to the 2023 report on how decisions are made, how governance of climate change operates, is that senior level of decision making needed to be in place. And I think what we're seeing is that important policy decisions have been taken, but perhaps without all of the wider considerations alongside multiple different policy choices being on the table at the same time. Yes.
Yes, I mean, I would also add to the fair fares review. So this is the review of concessionary travel that government undertakes regularly. So the last one, the report was published. Sorry, the commissioning of the review was in 2023. But after the review was done, a decision was made that we would retain concessionary, the concessionary schemes as they are. But what we notice in that conclusion from the review is there isn't much consideration of what that actually means for the car kilometres target. So it's just adding on to what the Auditor General has said there. So these reviews are undertaken, conclusions are reached, but there isn't much consideration of what does this mean for the target that we have set.
Is there a fundamental change happening, which this is perhaps an aspect of? We all talk about pre-COVID and footfall from pre-COVID in retail shops, in museums, public places and so on. And we're always saying it's not gone back to the pre-COVID level. We're talking about use of public transport. It's not gone back to the pre-COVID level. Has there been a fundamental change that we need to understand within society to make some of these initiatives effective?
So that's a very, very likely reality, Mr. Beattie, that people's habits and patterns have changed, and we refer to this in the report, that the extent of working from home arrangements, what that means for car usage, what it means for footfall in Scotland's towns and cities as well. It's a really good example, I think, in today's report about the implementation of bus gates in Aberdeen. That clearly we can, I think hopefully we reference sufficiently enough just what an emotive issue that was. But that it was attributed by retailers in the city as one of the reasons why footfall reduced. The council disagreed. They said that there were wider factors at play, changing habits of how people consumed retail, leisure, entertainment arrangements in the city because of the disruptive effect that the pandemic had and the provision of technology and other choices.
Data on that?
But apologies, I missed the start of your question. Could you?
Did the council have any data to back that up?
So I'll bring colleagues in. Actually, there was one of our case studies. Just trying if that's Ashley, you want to say more about that?
Yes, the council provided a paper to their full council that set out those reasons. I don't have those on me right now. I can provide further detail. But I think what's quite interesting in the case study is the improvements that the bus operators noticed from the bus gate. So they saw increased passenger numbers and improved journey times, which led them to put those savings back into providing free bus travel on Saturdays in January and free night buses over the Christmas period. They did some surveys as part of this paper and looked at the kind of footfall, but as I say, I don't have the details. I'd have to provide those.
Maybe just, we can certainly do that, of course, but I think go back, to your first point about have people's habits changed to the extent about what's a reliable baseline. Now, absolutely, that has to be part of the Scottish Government's route map as to how it sets a realistic, achievable target and how to get there, because although COVID had a disruptive effect, I think one of the things we found of most stark in today's report is just the rebound effect of individual car usage. So now higher than it was before the pandemic, but public transport use hasn't recovered to the same levels. So I would be speculating, Mr. Beattie, as to why one and not the other. What does that mean for people's habits? So, if you are only travelling to towns, cities, workplaces instead of 5 days a week, 2 or 3 days a week, does that influence the choices people are making? But I think these are absolutely the heart of the kind of data and basis for decision making that Scottish Government, Transport Scotland and their partners need to have.
What sort of over what sort of period would you expect to collect the data to have it as a meaningful indicator as to where we're going?
I suspect that's probably a question. Maybe Cornelius might want to comment from his professional background, but I think that's the kind of decision that the Transport Scotland, Scottish Government will need to take. Inevitably, we're in a volatile environment. Are we seeing enough trends that say that these are reliable indicators? Unfortunately, I think it's the type of the Scottish Government will have to make decisions based on probably imperfect information. If it's to deliver its ambitions for net zero in 20 years from now. Cornelius can certainly comment.
Yes, so I mean the data is currently published with a lag, probably reflecting the time it takes to collect the data, process it, and report it. So currently we have data for 2023. So I would like to believe there's always going to be that 2-year lag in the reporting. But I think just to add the significance of the pandemic. So when you look at, I think it's Exhibit 4, so 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, was the only time where this target has been achieved since, as we said, 1994. The pandemic was a dreadful period for all of us. But I think there might have been opportunity there for government. Well, how does it sustain that change in people's travel behaviours in order to stay on target? But I think what the Auditor General is trying to highlight is the government has probably not been successful in almost banking that change that had happened during the pandemic of keeping car use below what it had set as its target. That's probably one way of looking at the significance of the pandemic when looking at these numbers. It is the only time the target has been achieved since 1994.
Just to move on to one last question about infrastructure delivery. We talked previously that in 2019 the government allocated or committed £500 million in long-term funding to deliver infrastructure such as bus lanes, bus gates and so on. And all that was through the Bus Partnership Fund. By the end of 2023, only £25.9 million had actually been allocated to delivery partners. Your report on paragraph 73 states that in 2023, budgetary constraints meant that the then Cabinet Secretary had to confirm there were no plans to continue funding the BPF in 24-25. So that's, I know, according to the data here, has affected Aberdeen Rapid Transit and various other projects in other cities. Now, you provide some information in case study 3 on some of these projects, but can you give a wee bit more detail on the funding that was announced in 2019 for long-term infrastructure delivery to prioritise road space for buses and improve public transport journeys? What's actually been done, and what impact will it have now that the funding has been paused?
Yeah, you're right, Mr. Beattie. You've touched on much of the circumstances that we set out in the report. I'll turn to Ashley and Malcolm, of course, if there's anything he wants to add about a couple of the specifics. But effectively, this is, as you describe, that 6 years ago, the Scottish Government committed £500 million long-term funding to deliver the type of infrastructure of bus gates, bus lane through its bus partnership funding to improve bus journey times and give priority to buses over other road users. Clearly linked to some of the demand management arrangements, make public transport more attractive. You can get around, especially at times congested urban areas, much quicker in public transport than you would do in a private car. However, by the end of 2023, only £26.9 million had been allocated to delivery partners. As Cornelius mentions, that was a project, a fund that was directly impacted by COVID-19. So the availability of projects were too few to support the ambitions that were originally set out in the project. And then again, at the end of 23, that aligned with what some of the emergency funding arrangements that took budget arrangements that took place, that the Bus Partnership Fund would not be continuing from 2024-25. I think, again, Ashley can sit in more detail behind that, but I suppose it's the interconnection of all the policy choices about the extent to which public transport, bus gates, prioritisation for buses over cars, what direct role that's going to have in reducing car usage in Scotland. And I think is having greater clarity through a clear delivery plan about the individual contributions that different parts of the system are going to have to reduce car usage is a very important next step. But again, Ashley can set out more for that, and of course Malcolm, if you wish.
So the Bus Priority Fund was announced in a programme for government in 2019. From speaking to stakeholders, they said that when it was announced, the projects just weren't ready to go. These things take time to plan, to go through business cases. So initially, the projects weren't there. So that's why it's quite a low level of spend. Again, the pandemic impacted that. The buses weren't running to the same extent. So a lot of the funding was also spent on business cases and feasibility studies. And Transport Scotland tell us that there is now a suitable pipeline of work if that was to continue. But it was paused in 23. And I think that kind of leads back to that kind of budget decisions getting made and the prioritisation and that kind of lack of clarity around the target and if it's important. I'd just maybe say what that funding was for and how it would be used. We talk about bus lanes and about bus gates and that kind of thing. What it does is it makes the bus journey, the buses can travel freely through the city. They're not subject to congestion in the way that cars are. And it's part of that carrot stick kind of idea that we've been talking about. So one, you're making the buses more reliable because they're not sitting in traffic. But you're also making it slightly less easy to drive your car because you've taken a lane away and you've put that to buses only. So there's the two kind of elements working together, and the hope is that it might reduce car use. But yeah, as the funding hasn't gone ahead, that's still to be seen.
There seems to be an element of user kickback on some of these terms, especially bus gates. I've seen here in Edinburgh there's an issue as well with bus gates, and I think they're going to be reversing part of that. Is there any consistent thread through this of, if you like, consumer dissonance over the works that are being done?
So I certainly think that was very clearly the circumstances in Aberdeen that we set out in the case study, that despite the intention that bus gates would reduce bus journey times, improve their punctuality, and a better environment for pedestrians and other road users, was absolutely butting up against the desire of car users, retailers, leisure providers in the city, and that you talk about dissonance, Mr. Booty. Absolutely. You know, I think it's very much part of the demand management. It's like that, some would say that's both a good example of carrot and stick. And I think it comes back to it's not going to be straightforward to reduce car usage by 20%. These aren't easy choices that we'll make. Some of the demand management list we set out in Exhibit 8 on page 37, it's inevitable that many of these will be very unpopular. You only need to look at, so the workplace parking licence as an example of that. Only Glasgow City Council is currently considering that as an option. So how we overcome these will be the challenge of the next few years about which levers to pull at which points. And I think what history has suggested over the past 10 years that we might deploy one and then step back from it in parts and bring in other incentives to get to it. So the use of bus gates, additional bus lanes will just be one part of these tools that are available to policymakers to deliver this very challenging target.
Maybe we recommend that the Scottish Government start a national conversation with the public, and I think this is maybe part of the dissonance you talk about. At the moment, the public seems fairly unaware of the target. They want to do well with climate change, but when it comes to the details of how climate change will affect them, they find it more difficult. And research has shown that people want more clearer engagement and more information around transport's contribution to climate change and how that will affect them. So that's why we recommend that Scottish Government and Transport Scotland start this national conversation and start bringing people on board with them so that when they're making these potentially difficult decisions, people understand the reasons why better.
The problem with national conversations are they usually pull in the same people every time. So you're not really getting down to where you want to get down to. That's the way it is. Thank you, Convener.
Deputy Convener. Thanks for those questions, Colin. I'm conscious of the time and the need to get in two more groups of questions. But I think picking up the theme that we've been just talking about, the Deputy Convener's got some questions to put to you. Jamie.
Thank you, Convener. Just waiting on my microphone. Lovely. Sorry, can I just pick you up on something you just said? Audit Scotland are calling on the Scottish Government to have a national conversation. But your whole report says that there's been enough talk, we need more action. So that contradicts the essence of your report, Auditor General.
So I think the two can exist, Deputy Convener, that there hasn't been a translation of the original policy intent into a delivery plan. So, if you go back to 2021, what was absolutely a very ambitious target, as we see in other spheres, to do something challenging in terms of implementation of public policy. It has to be accompanied by a successful or planned implementation approach. We didn't see that here. So I think there's a significant gap. But I think the point Ashley makes, which I agree with, is that government can't do this alone. So we found that the public aren't really aware that there was an intention to reduce car usage by 20%. So that won't happen in and of itself. There has to be effective communication, awareness raising, giving people viable alternative choices. Some of that will be through reward or incentive, carrot, and some of that will be through stick. So I think we're satisfied. I'm clear that both those things can coexist.
I think the problem is that all the measures seem to be sticks, not carrots. We've got an abundance of sticks being bandied around by government, and I'm going to come on to some of that demand management issue in a moment. But another question I did have was, we talked just in the last session about measures around things like bus lanes and bus gates, and there's some anecdotal look at that in your case studies in the report. But is there any empirical evidence that demonstrates that the implementation of these measures, particularly bus lanes and city centres, has led to a reduction in car usage, has led to an increase in public transport usage, has improved air quality or lowered emissions, or in any way contributed towards modal shift? Because I'm entirely unclear as to whether these measures are actually working or not, and I think that's really what people want to know.
So I'll bring colleagues into a bit more detail on the evidence that we found and how that's being used by policymakers and implementation to deliver that strategy. But I think the overall message is clear. There wasn't enough translation of how these various multiple individual measures to reduce car usage, whether it's investment in public transport or active travel, which ones were having the biggest impact. When you look at the suite of choices, which one to push further with because they're having a benefit from that, whether it's CO2 or wider air quality factors. Lots of competing pressures. And I think for me, perhaps the peak rail fares is the best example of how that was evaluated on a value for money basis, but rather than no direct connection but did that reduce car usage, which was also a very important government objective at that point. I'll bring Cornelius or Ashley, whichever we prefer.
Yes. Yeah, no, I think, the case studies might feel like localized evidence, but I think if you think of it in terms of, is there a theory of change to what we are seeing in these case studies, one would say, the evidence do support that these things do work. These interventions do work. It's all about increasing how quickly traffic flows, reduce journey times. You then reduce the cost associated with time travel for commuters. So people are then likely to use public transport more. So I would say the evidence we are seeing in Aberdeen, Stagecoach seeing increases in passenger numbers by 5% and First Bus by 16.5% is credible evidence from evaluation that these things actually work.
Isn't the problem though that comes at the expense of other targets? So, shifting 2 lanes of traffic going into 1 lane of traffic increases congestion, which therefore increases emissions from vehicles and so on. So are we looking at this holistically enough, do you think? It's all very well said there's been a 5% increase in the rise in bus transport usage in one city, but at the same time, there may be other issues around the byproduct of some of these measures. And I have to say, you don't have to go very far from the Parliament building to see the effect that the low emission zone has had on roads like Abbey Hill, where it would take 5 minutes to get up, it now takes 15 or 20 or even more, because people are circumventing the traffic measures, the traffic reduction measures in cities. Glasgow is the same, and I'm sure Aberdeen has suffered in a similar manner. So, we can pick and choose success measures when it suits us, but are we doing that at the expense of the bigger picture?
That's right. And I think, as the Auditor General mentioned earlier, I think this reflects the complexity of delivering the target, and therefore the need for more detailed analysis, planning to ensure that all those sort of second-order impacts are taken into account. But I completely agree with you. There will be knock-on impact elsewhere, and that just needs to be looked at in terms of the complexity of trying what we are trying to do.
Yeah, I agree. This is complex. And there will be trade-off and choices. So we haven't done an audit of the low emission zone clearly, but that it's a very live example of ambitions to improve air quality will have a knock-on impact on economic activity, and that's the understandable trade-off. I don't think any of this is going to be straightforward or easy, especially if the scale of change that's required to deliver net zero. It's perhaps too glib to talk about carrot and stick, because ultimately, and the convener quite rightly mentioned the equalities impact of this earlier, that all of these very complex criteria will have to be factored into the choices that policymakers will make, scrutiny that goes alongside that, but ultimately how the general public react.
Good, I'm just about to come on to that. Can I ask perhaps taking a step back, a more fundamental question? It's something I've been grappling with throughout this session and when I read your report is what is your understanding of the point of the target? The target is to reduce the number of miles driven by domestic cars in Scotland. What is the point of it? What is the government trying to achieve by reducing that, do you think?
Cornelius can say a word in a moment, but I think why that and not anything else? I think it goes back to Exhibit 1, and notwithstanding Mr Beattie's line of questioning about the presence of commercial vehicles, but for mileage that is driven, domestic transport remains the largest contributor to Scotland's emissions, alongside significant other contributors to it, and we set that out. So deploying a range of suites across these different industries and ways remains the largest. And as I said in my introductory remarks, Deputy Convener, it's moving at the slowest pace in terms of reducing its contribution.
What you're saying is that the point of the target itself, which is the whole core of essence of your report, is to reduce the number of miles driven by the general public in their cars, with a view to reduce emissions. It's the emission reduction bit of it that seems to be driving the whole point of the target and the so-called strategy, yeah?
That's correct.
Right. Are we looking at all this the wrong way, though? Should the target not be to reduce emissions from cars, not to reduce the number of miles driven by cars? And I say that because I'm going to make a point about the types of cars that we drive in a second. Surely the means to the end is more important than the goal itself. So if the point is to reduce emissions, then why is the target not a 20% reduction in emissions from domestic car use? Because that would be a more sensible, surely, a target that actually you could see particular interventions that could deliver that in a more easy way than simply this very specific target that actually doesn't necessarily meet the objective it's trying to achieve.
So effectively, I think what you're suggesting is, for those vehicles that use an internal combustion engine, they should be the issue as opposed to electric vehicles, perhaps. And I think what we're clear, as I mentioned earlier, we're considering doing further work specifically on electric vehicles and infrastructure charging arrangements, but technology is changing really quickly. We also have policy ambiguity or changes from the UK government. So we know the date with which petrol and diesel vehicles were no longer able to be sold. That timescale has moved out 5 years. And alongside this was a target that was set 4 years ago with the adoption of electric vehicles varying in and amongst that. So, of course, I think what we're saying, what our audit looked to do was to evaluate the progress against the target the Scottish Government had chosen to reduce car usage by 20%. We've called, I think, throughout the report, I mentioned it a number of times this morning, is for clarity around that, even to the extent, I think, probably quite unusually for us to say, I think, having completed our audit, we weren't clear if the government was still committed to this specific target at the end of our audit work. And there's looking for that clarity, Deputy Convener. I think that's hugely important, given the impact that this will have if as a country we move firmly towards it. We've not done that yet. So as I mentioned, that car kilometre use is higher than it was before the pandemic. So to return to levels last seen in 1994 will have a huge bearing upon everybody. So how that works with internal combustion engine mileage or electric vehicle mileage, really that clarity is vitally important.
Essentially, I say this because, if you had a million miles driven by combustible engine cars and you reduce that by 20%, as the target seems to allude to, then there is an assumption that would reduce emissions, which drives the underpinning of the strategy. If instead it went in the other direction, and instead of 1 million miles, you had 1.5 million miles, but they're all driven by electric or hybrid cars, then you may still see a reduction in emissions. Yet the mileage being driven by the public is going up, as you allude to. So I would have some sympathy if the government just dropped the target, but if they were doing it for the right reason, because actually what they were trying to do is reduce emissions. I could demonstrate that policies would achieve the same result, the target itself being irrelevant, perhaps.
For us to come in a moment, actually, but I think the one thing I would say is that we're not climate scientists, but I think it's a fair comment that electric vehicles aren't emission-free. There is still CO2 that is displaced in the creation of electric vehicles and then when they are decommissioned. So it's perhaps not, you're suggesting this otherwise, but it's not going to be a panacea in terms of a complete reduction in CO2 by moving from internal combustion engine vehicle to an electric vehicle. It goes back to the clarity, Deputy Convener, but Cornelius, you want to comment?
Yes. Yeah, I think you make an important point, Deputy Convener, and I think it's something we could have been more maybe bold in our statement in this. If you look at paragraph 14, the last bullet point, where we say modelling commissioned by Transport Scotland to understand how to meet the emissions target, only considered the 20% reduction. I mean, what we're trying to highlight there is by only considering the 20% reduction in car kilometres, they could have actually maybe looked at other options. And what you are highlighting there is maybe focusing on reducing emissions will enable you to think of other options that might contribute to the target. Whereas in this case, I think they've narrowly focused on let's reduce car kilometres, maybe at the expense of other things they may have considered. I think this is important also from a point of view of how best to use public money, value for money. If you are not considering the full spectrum of options that you have to achieve your goal, which is reducing emissions, getting to net zero by 2045, there's a question there: are we assuring ourselves that we are delivering with value for money if we are not considering everything that might be possible?
That's very interesting. And I'm looking forward to seeing any work that you do on electric vehicles, given the sort of, what I would say, quite a dire state in Scotland and across the UK on that. You only need to look to not far away in Norway, where 89% of all new car sales last year were electric or hybrid, actually electric, compared to 24% in the UK. Indeed, there are only 6% of all vehicles in Scotland are electric or hybrid, compared to over 40% in Norway, and so on, and charging stations and all the issues that go along with that. So I'm looking forward to that piece of work. But I think one of the things that struck me in the course of this morning's session is this: you talked a lot about these demand management measures, and you talk about the carrot and stick approach, but some of these measures are undoubtedly unpopular. But not just unpopular, I would argue perhaps even punitive and discriminatory. So what analysis do you think would need to take place in order for the government to consider some of these measures, some of them reasonably harsh, considering that many people who drive a car already consider it to be quite an expensive and punitive thing to do, even out of necessity?
Yeah, so you're right. I think as we discussed briefly earlier, a few things, and I bring colleagues in a moment just to elaborate if they so wish. None of these are easy. These will cost significant amounts of public money. Some will have and will enter a space where there's a competing policy intent around them. So the low emissions was perhaps a good example about designed to improve air quality, but at the same time perhaps inconveniencing some road users, the impact that it might have on footfall in town centres and so forth. I'm not expressing a view on that. I just think these are the facts or the basis that will be subject to debate. We also note that, as I mentioned, not all of these within the power of the Scottish Government. Some will be reserved to Westminster. Although some of them are within the gift of Scottish local authorities already in terms of some of the road charging elements. Before bringing colleagues in on it, I would just perhaps highlight that Transport Scotland has had a look at this. So they commissioned research to look at aspects of or some of the modelling that might go alongside this. It's taken a while for that to be published and become available. I think, given how significant some of the behavioural changes that we might be looking at and might be necessary to move towards, whether it's 20% or whichever target, undoubtedly we're going to have to lead our lives differently. If it's whether it's the 2030, but probably more realistically the 2045 target, that's going to, and I think perhaps go back to your first question about effective communication, whether it's national conversations or otherwise, and transparency has to be at the heart of that to support people's understanding and help them make informed choices. But I'll bring Ashley in first of all if there's anything she wants to cover.
Thank you. So in terms of demand management, there's been quite a bit of detailed analysis done by some of the case study councils around how they might go about achieving 20% reduction in car use. And that's detailed in paragraph 84. And that modelling shows that it tends to be the longer journeys that make up these larger, that make up the bulk of the car kilometres. So stopping those through active travel won't work, and it needs to be through public transport. They also did a whole load of research around these specific interventions. What kind of impact would they have? And we set that out in paragraph 84. For example, active travel improvements would have the potential to reduce car kilometres by 3%, bus improvements by 1%, but road pricing by 10%. So the impact that you're going to have is going to be higher if you're doing more of the stick than the carrot. So Transport Scotland have done their own research, and that sets out the same kind of thing, that to be able to get those big reductions in car use, you need to think about charging options.
But let's we're sitting here in the Parliament. Which government in their right mind, particularly coming into an election year, would implement punitive measures such as national charging or road tolls, or start rolling out national rather than localised and blaming the councils, but actually, from a national point of view, putting out primary legislation that would actually impose quite expensive and punitive measures on drivers would surely be, it would be political suicide for any government in any jurisdiction. So, I mean, realistically, it seems, they might help meet the target, but they're very unlikely to happen for sure.
And Transport Scotland recognise that we don't currently have the levers that would allow us to do national charging. That would require different legislation. And they recognise that, and they've committed to kind of lobbying the UK government more around that. We say in the report that the demand management report was written 2 years ago, and it's only just been published. Even when it was written, timescales were tight to achieve the 2030 target. Now, 2 years down the line, it's very unlikely that even if any of these measures were implemented, that they would have the impact by 2030. And again, that links back to what we were saying already around the target and how ambitious it was.
I think so these were choices, weren't they? The political choices, and as to which. Based on effective communication, best provision of information. So I think it's absolutely the case, without much disagreement, that some of these will be unpopular. And perhaps what's some of the benefit of policymakers, that there's not just one model here that can deliver net zero. So, investment in public transport, active travel, as you mentioned, Deputy Convener, the type of car that people drive, but what we're looking for is that clarity. What's the route map to deliver, and where is public spending delivering best effect upon the success of that target?
Time, just one final question, then I'll pass on to Stuart McMillan. Here's what I really don't understand, though, and I'm not here to, support the Scottish Government in their success or otherwise. But if I was the Scottish Government and I was sitting here, I'd be saying, in response to all this session, is that we spend over £1 billion on rail services, publicly subsidised and nationalised 2 services. We heavily subsidise the bus industry. Around 60% of private operators' revenue comes from concessionary travel or direct grants from national or local government. We have many and numerous concessionary travel schemes that target the young and old, perhaps people who don't own cars anyway. And we invest in subsidised ferry services and hundreds of millions of pounds in active and sustainable travel. And despite all of that, we're going in the wrong direction in terms of the target. You know, the fundamental question is what on earth does the government actually need to do to drive the sort of modal shift that you think would help meet the target? Because I can't see it.
So it needs to know, or it needs to be clear as to what public spending is designed to achieve, because it's not just doing one thing. So at the moment, the emphasis is on the original intent for some of that public spending. But what we haven't seen in our work on today's report is that public spending on these schemes contributing to a reduction in car usage. So I guess we're not drawing any inference of there's a hierarchy of policy here. That'll be a choice for government. But if the delivery of reduction of car usage, the 2030 target, and then net zero by 2045, all of that has to be clear. And I think, so we're certainly not making any judgment about the value of providing subsidy to bus operators or rail usage, because they're delivering other policy intent. But what we weren't clear when we looked at this, part of overall arching strategies for reducing car use, as to where that public spending was making a difference or not. So it's both those things, effectively.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Convener. And I mean, I think you sum it up again in the report, which we mentioned at the start of this morning's session, which is where you say it's impossible to understand which interventions will have the most impact on the target or deliver best value for money. And until we establish that, it seems to me it is difficult to answer the questions that the Deputy Convener has been putting, because what you're identifying is a shortage of data, an absence of evaluations that are meaningful, things not being seen through the prism of meeting this target. So I'm going to move on now and invite Stuart McMillan to put some questions to you. Stuart.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Convener. Just a range of questions kind of dotted throughout the actual report. But before I get into them, I think just on following on from Colin's questions earlier with regard to the additional information that's to be sent to the committee, can that information also be put on to the Audit Scotland website beside this report, so that actually helps provide that background?
Yeah, just report, please. For clarity, what additional information we'll have, we'll share with the committee, and a choice for the committee, of course, to publish that through your own correspondence. If there's any information that we haven't been clear on, we'll do likewise. Okay,
thank you. On section 13, and it follows on from Jamie Green's questions a moment ago regarding the electric vehicles. And Jamie helpfully put a variety of information there, particularly regarding Norway. Now, you did say that you are considering looking into this, so will that work actually take place, or is it still in a consideration mode at the moment?
Yeah, so I haven't committed to that yet. I think, as you'll be aware, Mr McMillan, that there's a range of choices that I have to make, and across how public money is spent. I will be clearer on that over the next few weeks, and then consulting with the Public Audit Committee in April, I believe, on my forward work programme. So that at that point, I'll be able to set out the work that I intend to undertake with precision for the forward 12 months, and then again with what my intentions are for the following 12 months thereafter.
Okay, no, thank you. Because genuinely, I think that it's a very valid area to look at. But also, I mean, there's a variety of elements to it too. Also, it's not just about the charging points and the vehicles. I mean, the vehicles themselves, I mean, they're not cheap. And certainly the higher range electric vehicles are more reliable as compared to those at the lower range. And just from an economic perspective, I'll refer to it was a report published earlier this month from the Loughborough Centre for Research and Social Policy, which highlighted that 24 million people living in the UK are living in socially unacceptable living standards. So the economic challenge of actually purchasing an electric vehicle certainly prohibits people from actually wanting to do the right thing.
I think I've not read that report, but I'll certainly do so. And actually, and there was a report published this morning by the UK Committee on Climate Change, which is also very interesting reading, and again touches on some of the choices we have to make. But I think, actually, you were mentioning this earlier, but one of the references in there is that I think within 3 years there's an assumed alignment in the cost of electric vehicles, average cost, with petrol and diesel cars. So, of course, they're not cheap and likely out the reach of many people who might want to use them. Perhaps makes the point more strongly for active travel and public transport arrangements, but there's no doubt that electric vehicles are a core part of the solution towards net zero transport.
No, thank you. On section 17, where you reference the cross-governmental plan, is that only within Scotland, or is that also UK-wide as well?
So I will just turn to Ashley, actually, just
that's just
be
Scotland.
clear. Yeah,
that's the Just Transition Commission in Scotland. Yeah.
Because it then ties into section 14 and also on page 11 and also exhibit 8 on page 37 with regards to areas that are out with the Scottish Parliament parliamentary powers, particularly fuel duty. So as a potential, dare I say, suggestion, and it kind of touches upon the questions regarding bus travel also. I think section 27 in the report, sorry, not section 27, section 67 regarding the bus operators, obviously cancelling services and many challenges that they face. If bus travel was cheaper, it could certainly aid and encourage more people to actually use it. So surely there could be a discussion to be had with regards to reducing fuel duty for bus operators, but for that to then be passed on to reducing the cost of tickets to go and utilise buses.
I'm quite sure these will be the choices that Transport Scotland and the Scottish Government will want to consider as they develop their plan, alongside the engagement that they'll have with the UK Government, where those powers aren't devolved rather to the Scottish Parliament. I think your point I agree with. This is complex, so I don't think there's one single route to deliver either this target, a revised target, or indeed net zero by 2045. And that's going to require effective cooperation between the different spheres of government, between Scottish Government, UK Government, and absolutely between Scottish Government and local government in Scotland.
Thank you for that. Can I also refer back to section 16 again, and just get something that's been very much under discussion for quite some time. And many kind of all overarching reports that come from Audit Scotland, I will always look at them through the prism of how is this going to affect Inverclyde and the Greenford Inverclyde constituency. And there's a dialogue, also there's been past dialogue regarding a Glasgow Airport rail link, and now it's about some kind of metro scheme. But every option that's came forward has had and will have a negative impact upon public transport usage from Inverclyde, to reduce services from Inverclyde to outside, obviously up to Glasgow. And I've got a discussion, I've got a meeting with SPT about this on Friday. But surely any proposals, any projects that are to come forward from whether it's SPT or anywhere else across the country, surely they should be about adding to as compared to at the expense of.
So I think perhaps rather than drawing on the specifics of that particular example, is that the equalities impact needs to be known and understood in this. I think, as we set out perhaps in the, not to labour the point, Mr McMillan, about the bus gates in Aberdeen, that's a very clear example of where some parties were supportive and benefited from it, and others didn't. And I suspect there will be many more examples like this in the years to come, of where there will be competing interests to move towards net zero. That there's clarity around this from the Scottish Government and their partners, though, and that there is, I think, as mentioned at paragraph 17 rather, that transition is just, is planned for, and that policy also weaves in with the other intents towards net zero.
Just on the section 16, again, just in a different area, and that's on train travel. When this report was being put together, was there any analysis undertaken of the true cost of train journeys and train fares? Because I'm aware that also because ScotRail is one organisation, Network Rail is obviously still reserved to Westminster, but the cost of actually paying to access the rail will clearly add on to the cost of a ticket. So potentially, if Network Rail were to be devolved, that could have a positive impact to actually reduce the cost of tickets.
Before I just check colleagues on the scope, would you mind clarifying what you mean by the true cost, just so I understand properly? So,
if someone's buying a ticket to go and use a train, so purchasing the ticket, but part of that would also be covering the cost of accessing the rail. Because Network Rail is a separate organisation.
Understood, so transparency of it. I think the answer is no, that we didn't consider that as part of our scope for today's report.
Right, okay. On section 27 on page 16, the point of, and I'll quote, recent policy decisions suggest that the Scottish Government has deprioritised the target in the face of growing financial pressures, for example, the peak fares reversal, and reducing funding for active travel. Is that just, that's an opinion from yourselves? That's not, have you got anything to fully back that up?
Yes, that's a judgment that we've made on today's report, but I think it's supported by our consideration of the evaluation report that went alongside, which we mentioned in case study 1 on page 15 of the report, that the decision to end the removal of, or reinstate rather, peak time fares was made on the basis of value for money and the financial circumstances at the time, rather than whether or not reinstating peak fares, what bearing that would have on this, the central plank of today's report, of what bearing that would have on reduction of car usage.
Yeah, I think if I can add, I mean, you see this in other interventions as well. So the Bus Partnership Fund, which had a commitment of 500 million that has been suspended. We talked about the fares review, where this consideration, do we continue with this? Yes, we continue. But there isn't much consideration on what continuing actually means for the target. So there's a series of decisions that are being made, but you don't see a direct link between those decisions and the target, which then raises the question, is the target still that important? Particularly then when you look at the data, we are actually moving in the opposite direction to where we should be going.
Okay.
So it's acted on the basis of multiple things that we've observed.
Right. Okay, thank you. Section 34 and section 35 I thought were really interesting, particularly certainly the first bullet point in section 34, that the other directorates in the Scottish Government or councils will also decide where to locate services such as hospitals and schools, which will affect the extent to which people need to travel. And then section 35, councils have requested further guidance and support from the Scottish Government and so on. What type of guidance are they asking for? So I've got a particular point in this, but I'm keen to understand that first.
So I think, again, maybe Ashley or Malcolm might want to say a bit more about it, but I think as we've touched on, that there wasn't a route map delivery plan to support the implementation of the policy, was a key part in the concerns that councils expressed about not clarity about what role, and also councils are very different. So some will be able to, with the populations, make much more of a contribution to this target than others, based on their, particularly the geography of the circumstances that they have found themselves in.
Yeah, I think what councils would welcome is some guidance on how they can introduce demand management measures, and particularly in rural areas, how the target can be achieved. And of course, at the moment, because of the lack of guidance, they're not being held accountable for actually achieving the target. So I think some guidance on how the target can be achieved would be welcomed. Actually,
mainly just that, Malcolm, that we recommend that it should be clear about the role that rural councils can play, the guidance, and how that links in with the national planning framework. I think, just going back to the points around the delivery plan, it's not clear. It hasn't got clear roles and responsibilities. There's no impact for councils if they're not being shown to making progress. There's nothing that holds them to account. So it's that whole kind of picture.
I generally think that section 35 is a cop-out, to be quite honest. Because there are some urban authorities that will have some rural parts to it. So I accept the point about more just solely rural local authority areas. But once again, I think of my constituency and an area that is suggested for a housing development. It's equidistant between two train stations. It's just off of a trunk road. And the only way to get to any of the train stations will be to drive. Now, fine, active travel routes can get put in, but my area, it rains quite a lot, and so they will not be used a great deal. So the only way to get to somewhere is to go onto a road that is a trunk road that's already congested at the peak times. And despite folk highlighting the concerns, this is still being progressed. So this is where, from a planning perspective, I don't think councils don't need any additional guidance on planning. That's about, they know their area better as compared to any government of any colour and any stripes. So I think that so for me that section 35 in the report really is a cop-out when I consider what's going on in my patch.
So,
I think councils have to be clear and they have to set out how they're going to, what they're going to do to help achieve the target as one part of the landscape, if you like. But as Ashley and I said previously, because they're not being held accountable for it, it's difficult to, I guess, difficult to highlight that.
I wonder if I could say a wee bit more. So we say that there's a lack of leadership at all levels, so that includes at council level as well as at government level. We didn't look at Inverclyde as one of our case study councils, but within the case study councils that we looked at, we looked through minutes of committee meetings, and when they were discussing things like planning, we didn't see consideration of the car use target when they were making those decisions. So this is happening across all levels of government, that we're not seeing this priority being given to the target.
So it's a few years ago at one of the local community councils, there were local authority councils there too, and when the question came up about this particular proposal, one of the councillors, who's now no longer a councillor, they retired, said, well, the trunk road's not, that's not the problem of for the council to solve, that's the problem for the Scottish Government to solve. Instead of actually having the holistic approach to, if this goes ahead, what is the impact going to be upon the existing infrastructure? So I think that kind of justifies what you just said there, Ashley, in terms of that lack of leadership, I would suggest.
On Stuart?
Sure. So section 45 in the report and the detailed analysis, do you have any indication as to what the cost was for these reports?
Ashley, Malcolm?
No, I'm afraid not.
No, okay. Exhibit 4 on page 30. I thought was actually really helpful because also, once again, from a local perspective, and this isn't the fault of any government, it's not the fault of any council, it's a business decision. So EE, they've left Greenock, shut down their plant, shut down their call centre, moved all the staff up to Glasgow, and obviously it's a 7-day operation. So I know folk who work there who now they could use public transport to get to where they were in Greenock, but they now have to use a car because of the times, particularly weekends, when there is less public transport. So they now have to use a car. So in terms of the wider report, was any consideration given with regards to business requirements and business decisions that will have an effect upon the car usage?
So I think it's a factor, undoubtedly. You know, that as we talked about, a reference in the report of changes in working patterns. You know, so where people's place of work is, where they spend their leisure time, will all have a bearing on their car usage if they consider there's not a viable alternative. And I think perhaps maybe just speaks to this is going to be complicated to resolve, and goes back to that kind of sense of there are undoubtedly important, you know, whether it's demand management and trade-offs that will have to be made. But I think that's the point that perhaps goes back to the setting of the target that Mr Simpson asked about. 20% was chosen, but that wasn't consulted on. And why 20%? And why not 15%? Why not another number? And I think, you know, and where does the Scottish Government and Transport Scotland partners go from now to deliver a realistic target with an effective implementation plan?
Okay.
I mean, I can just add. So they've looked at the behaviours that need to support realisation of the target, and one of those behaviours is what they call choosing local destinations. So it is about ensuring that as much as possible, people are doing whatever they need to do within their local communities. And I guess what you are highlighting there is maybe that is where part of the focus ought to be. Are people able to work from their local areas so that they don't have to travel? But more important, I think it highlights a point that the Deputy Convener was making around, well, actually people are accessing some of these services because they need them. It could be access to health, access to education. So it then brings in that planning element that you are highlighting. How quickly then can we change these services so that they can mostly be accessed locally? I think what again it points to is this is going to be a long-term transformation that we need to go through, and maybe that has to be part of the consideration that government takes into account when deciding to set its target. Was 20% achievable by 2030, or maybe should it have been a target for a longer time? We don't know, but I think there's a consideration about how quickly can we move to achieve some of these things, given the transformations that we need to go through.
Very briefly, I would just add, we reference in the report refer to as 20-minute neighbourhoods. You're familiar with this, Mr McMillan, actually, just about the Scottish Government's national planning framework outlines the proliferation of 20-minute neighbourhoods where people can do most of the things that they want to within that time scale. Will also have a likely reduction in car usage. What it probably won't address, though, is I think the specific point that you make about where people's place of work changes and the choices that they'll have to make about how they can best get themselves to and from a change of location.
I've got an example in 20-minute neighbourhoods, but I won't go into it today because I can talk to you about it another time. So just
question, Stuart?
Yeah, sure. On section 92, the first bullet point on the equalities, have you had any dialogue with ScotRail regarding the work that they do with and they offer with regards to disability access?
Sorry.
We spoke to ScotRail as part of the audit, and inequalities came up in the interview, and it will have informed all our judgments around it, but I don't know if we looked at that specifics.
I think there's an excellent story to tell. I only found this out a few weeks ago because of dealing with them on behalf of a constituent. So I did put the point to ScotRail, they need to tell more people about what they're doing in terms of that openness and that offer to get more people. And as a consequence of that, certainly they told me that there are now more people with disabilities who are now travelling on the rail network as compared to sitting at home and doing nothing. Okay, and thank you very much, Convener.
Thank you. On that point of controversy, given lots of disabled groups are very upset about the reduction in station ticket office opening hours, we will bring this morning's evidence session to a close. Can I thank each of our guests this morning, Malcolm Bell from the Accounts Commission, Ashley Majiti from the Audit Scotland office, and Cornelius Chikwama, also from Audit Scotland. Can I thank you, and can I thank you particularly, Auditor General, for your patience this morning with some of our questions and the fullness of your responses. And I think you've undertaken to perhaps give us a bit more information, a bit more granular detail about what makes up so-called internationally defined domestic transport. So we look forward to seeing that and poring over it in the next few weeks. So thank you very much indeed. I'll now like to move the committee into private session. Thank you.